we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for those of you who are here with us today for Abundant Housing LA's Housing 101. My name is Luke Klipp. I'm the Education Director for Abundant Housing LA. It is a volunteer thing I do. This Housing 101 presentation I've put together is something I've done on my own time. I'm not getting compensated for any of this. And I just want to note that because I think sometimes there's some question around that. But it's something that I do because I love it. And I'm really grateful to those of you who are here to spend a couple hours on your Saturday afternoon with us. With that, I just want to quickly introduce Esteban Garcia, who's going to say a couple words about how this is going to work. Esteban, are you there?
I'm here. Hi, Luke. Thank you. Hi, everybody. So, sorry, I was just dealing with some emails. Yeah, so we'll have Luke will go through Housing 101 and his slides, and then at the end we'll have a Q&A. And so you should all have the Q&A function available, and I'll be here to ask Luke the questions that you ask to the Q&A function as they come. So, yeah, Luke, take it away.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Esteban. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. So this is a Housing 101. It's not a 201 or 301. This is intended as a primer to really just kind of start to dive into these issues a little bit and give you a general sense, sort of like the history, how that shapes our present. But there's any number of things in here that, frankly, you could create an entire course curriculum around all of the different things we're going to touch on. So I just want to be clear, like, as much as I would love to really kind of dive into a lot of these things, and we really truly could, we're gonna move relatively quickly. There's a lot of information, and I want to give everyone here an opportunity when I'm done to ask as many questions as you got. This is probably going to take about an hour and 15, hour and a half to go through all this, and then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. So agenda here. Here's our agenda. We're going to just, like I said, we'll go through the history, how it shapes our present, talk a little then about Housing LA's theory of change and some approaches that we would recommend around policy changes to move forward, and then ways that you can get involved. This is a photo of St. Joseph's Hospital in Superior, Wisconsin. I share this photo because I think it's really important to kind of ground this in why each one of us comes to this conversation. This hospital was built in the 30s. Superior's an old shipping town on the western tip of Lake Superior, where I lived for a few years as a kid in this hospital. And this was a hospital that was no longer operational. There were some just kind of ancillary uses that were brought into it, but we lived as a family up on the third floor. The delivery room was our living room. We had crank hospital beds, but these were all things that were only made possible because the folks in Superior were willing to have families living in this old hospital. And it wasn't exactly a home per se, but it was a place that worked for us for the time that we lived in this building. And I just offer that because I think I have privilege, right? I am a white guy. I have a lot of privilege. And as we'll see through this presentation, I have a great deal of privilege as a result of my race in the housing conversation. But all of us have moments in our lives, or I should say many of us have moments in our lives that could be, a year or two, that could be many, many, many years, where we've experienced different degrees of housing security or insecurity that I just think it's important to recognize and acknowledge. Are things that bring us to this conversation, are perspectives that inform how we look at this and view this conversation around housing. And frankly, for a lot of us, we come to this conversation specifically here with Hunger Games, because good luck. It is a very, very difficult market. It's very, very expensive, and we'll be diving into more about sort of what that's about in just a minute here. But first, I want to just call out a little video that popped up on Twitter the other day that I think kind of helps with sort of shaping this conversation a little bit.
Y'all want to see the wealth gap in LA? Let me show you. I have to walk down this street in order to catch a bus, right? However, there's a gate blocking this entire fucking street because this is where a lot of more wealthy individuals live, right? Like, I can't even get through the gate. Mind you, both Google, City Mapper, every navigation app is telling me to go down this street in order to get to my bus, but I can't. You know why? Because this gate's locked because, once again, wealthy individuals, yeah. And that, the wealth gap with yours truly. Oh, and I'm about to miss my bus because I have to walk all the way fucking around, get to a bus. For the stupid ass gate. And now, as you can see, I'm still walking down. There's still more gates, so I have to go all the way to a bigger street to get to where I need to go. Waste my time.
So that young woman is walking through Country Club Park, or walking around Country Club Park, because she can't exactly walk through it. Country Club Park was mapped in the redlining area. It was described that the minimum size of single-family dwellings protected against quote-unquote racial hazards, and that those minimum lot sizes were responsible for homogeneity of the population. This was almost a century ago. It was designated as a historic community by the LA City Council 10 years ago. And one of the reasons they designated historic was for its having matured in the 1920s, which, oh, by the way, was an era which we'll see shortly, where we had racial deed restrictions working en masse. So this was a community that was racially restricted only to white individuals for many, many years. But the designation that the LA City Council conferred upon Country Club Park also cited the proximity of this neighborhood to the original Pico Boulevard streetcar. That young woman was walking on Pico Boulevard, and ironically, you can't actually access Pico Boulevard from that area of Country Club Park because of those gates. You're actually barred from it. The only detriment to the designation of historic preservation overlay zone when the City Council made that designation 10 years ago, the only thing they saw as potentially working against that was that there was some quote-unquote infill development that had occurred in the community since it was built up at the first time in the early part of the 20th century with all its single-family homes, i.e. there had been some apartments that had been built that were sort of encroaching upon those historic single-family homes, which were homes that had for many, many, many years only been available to white people. So this history happened many, many years ago, but as you can see from this young woman just trying to go catch her bus, there are ways, I mean, this is, you know, kind of an extreme example with the fencing that doesn't exist in many other places in the city of LA, but it does exist here. And for this young woman, it actually makes it much more difficult for her to just go catch a bus. So I think it's important to kind of tie together how things we've done in our history really still play out in our present. So some of you may have seen this tweet the other day from our tweeter-in-chief up in the Oval Office, where he was happy to inform all the people living their suburban lifestyle dream that they would no longer be bothered or financially hurt by having low-income housing built in their neighborhood. We're not going to get into the whole Obama era affirmatively furthering fair housing rule that the current president revoked, but suffice it to say that I think this particular moment, this tweet, really kind of shone a bright spotlight on how housing history and the way that we've done housing for many, many decades really truly is race-based, and that we use different language, coded language today that many of us don't even necessarily recognize or realize is based in very race and racist kinds of ways of doing business. So there are a few core central ideas that we're going to keep hitting on as we go through this presentation. I really just want to kind of drive these home. The first of these core ideas is that single-family zoning leads to some really significant challenges in our communities. I'm also calling it actually build in LA single-family zone. You can build single-family homes anywhere. You can build them anywhere, except for if it's zoned industrial. But you cannot build apartments or condominiums anywhere other than where it's specifically allowed. You can't, there's a lot of our land in LA is zoned just for single family homes, and that's it. And you can also build those everywhere else. But in any case, single-family zoning, I said, pointing out here, leads to a number of issues: wealth and opportunity disparities, unaffordable rents, and homelessness. The next core concept I really am going to keep hitting on here is his housing policy is systemically racist, and it has been for a very, very long time. That's just something that comes up and comes up and comes up. The next core concept I really wanted to hammer home here is that we need to distinguish between opinions that are opinions of an individual and opinions of an institution. And I'm showing here a map of a good portion of the city of Los Angeles that's color-coded pink and blue. This was a map that was presented in an article in the New York Times last year, where they looked at a number of cities across the country. And all of these areas that are colored pink and blue in this map in the city of LA are areas that are zoned for housing. Everything that's colored pink is zoned for single-family housing. Everything that's colored blue is zoned for multifamily housing, anywhere from 2 units on a property to 3, 4, 5, and up. And you'll see here that the pink is much more than the blue. And in fact, in the city of LA, of our residentially zoned areas, 75% is zoned for single family only. And that holds about 1/3 of our population. So the vast majority of our land in the city of LA is cordoned off for a minority of the population, which is overwhelmingly white. And so I just want to call this out, like, you and I can express opinions about what we think is the right or wrong thing to be doing in terms of housing policy, but the institutional opinion is that the value here is on single family zoning, because so much of our land we've given over to that one use. And you can see that play out very when you go around our communities. I've just offered here some examples. Upper left hand corner of the Encino Hills, single family homes in the hillsides. Upper right hand corner, you got in the San Fernando Valley, as we all know, many blocks of single family homes. Lower right-hand corner showing part of Westlake MacArthur Park neighborhood, where we have multifamily zoning and we see apartment buildings throughout there. One of the most affordable communities in the city of LA, a community that has some of the most low-income folks anywhere in the city proper, but it's also a place where they can afford to live. And then the lower left-hand corner is a sort of this oddity out by Westwood known as Condo Canyon, where you literally have this strip along Wilshire Boulevard where we've zoned to allow massive condominium buildings, which directly adjacent to them, we only allow single-family homes. And those single-family homes go for millions and millions of dollars. And the only difference between 200-unit condominium, where 200 different families can purchase a share of that piece of that building, is that we've allowed it by zoning. So this is an expression of an institutional opinion. The institutional opinion being that single family zoning is more important than anything else. So we're going to dive in here. So our housing history. I offer a quick this photo of an old school rotary telephone. Some of you may not even realize it's a telephone, depending on how long you've been paying attention to this sort of technological development. But what's interesting to me about this is that actually our oldest area codes in the country are low numbers. So like in LA, 213 or 310, in San Francisco, 415, in Chicago, or excuse me, in DC, it's 202, in New York, it's 212, in Chicago, it's 312. This is because when you're having to already dial 10 digits, because you have to dial the 1 and then the area code, the idea was let's make it as little bit of time as possible, because you have to turn this knob every time you dial a number. And it's just one of these strange little artifacts of time that we still have those area codes, but now we have a bunch more of these bigger number area codes that are coming in. We have more and more telephone numbers. And it doesn't matter anymore, right? But at one time, it really did matter. And so we have these sort of like this juxtaposition of old school area codes and new area codes. And it's a really minor thing in the grand scheme of things. But the reason we have those small digit area codes that are around from, a century ago is because this was the way you dial them. And so I just want to call it out, because we may not necessarily this a century ago or 80 years ago or 50 years ago have such an influence over how we do things today, but they do. I'm not going to dive into all this time right on this slide. We're going to go through all these things. Timeline. On the lower part of the timeline, I've indicated I've provided the population growth of the city of LA over time. Over the past century, LA has added about 40,000 residents every single year, on average every year for 100 years. That's gone up, it's gone down, and right now we're right about at that average, around 35, 40,000 new residents a year. Most of our population growth right now is what demographers call natural growth. It's more people being born than people who are dying. It's not because of in-migration. And then the top part of this is a series of events that we're going to walk through in just a minute. But they're all events that sort of continue to sort of bring up and drive home this point about the linkages between systemic racism in our housing policy and sort of what are the policies that we've been implementing. The three things I want to really sort of drive home here on this particular timeline are those. I've got three colored bars: this brown bar, this red bar, and this orangish bar. The first brown bar is a period of time in which we had race-restricted deed race covenants. So you could purchase a home only if you were white, and you could only resell that home to someone else for several decades until, well, with the US Supreme Court decision Shelley v. Kraemer, which we'll get to in a little bit. But then overlapping with that, we have this red bar. This is the period of redlining, and we'll get into what redlining was. And then finally, we have this yellow bar, which is mostly an approximation, but it's a period of downzoning, of significant downzoning throughout our region. This is downzoning that we did throughout all the state of California. We certainly did it here in Los Angeles, and we'll see the impact of what that was. So first we have Buchanan v. Warley 17. And this was the decision at the US Supreme Court where they outlawed explicit race-based zoning. So specifically in the city of Louisville, they had zoning codes that they had implemented that said, if you are trying to purchase or rent a home in a community that is majority white, we ban discrimination on the basis of race, you'd be wrong. But however, the Supreme Court did say that the state is not in a position to enforce this kind of zoning code. So what did we do? Well, first, we created single-family zoning. Los Angeles adopted single-family zoning as one of the first cities to adopt it in 1921. And single-family zoning enabled, and single-family homes enabled this deed restriction, these covenants, where you could say, if you're going to buy this land and this home, you can only do so if you're white. And then as part of purchasing that land and that home, there was a deed attached to it that said, and you can only resell it to people who are white. We also restricted these things, not just on the basis of race, but also on the basis of religion, that you could only resell it to someone who was Christian. So here's a couple brochures. On the left is a brochure for Hollywood land. We're all familiar with the Hollywood sign. The Hollywood sign is a relic because it used to be, the full sign was Hollywood land. It was an advertisement for the community directly below the sign in the hills there, that when it was first created in the 1920s, advertised itself as being secured by fixed and natural restrictions against the inroads of metropolitanism, and yet within 25 minutes of 7th and Broadway, which at the time was the heart of LA's commercial district. Do not be fooled by the language of secured by fixed and natural restrictions. The natural restrictions would be the hills. The fixed restrictions are the deeds, are the race covenants that were in place at that time in this and many other single-family communities that were building up throughout LA at that time. Important to remember, there wasn't a lot of big housing at this time. When LA, back in that timeline, around 1910, LA was about 500,000 residents. We grew pretty quickly and we added a lot of housing. So these were areas where there was no housing. So a lot of people were buying homes in areas there had been none. So they were buying the home for the very first time. And they were buying it with these restrictions, both in terms of who could buy it and then who you could resell it to. On the right, the brochure for Eagle Rock's a little more explicit because in the second to the bottom line there, you can see they say the residents of Eagle Rock are all of the white or Caucasian race. Now you'll know, anyone who's familiar with Eagle Rock today, you know that's not true now, but it was certainly what they were advertising and trying to sort of keep in place at the time, back when this was advertising this a century ago. That bottom right, attention white home buyers, this was language you would see in these kinds of brochures all over the place. That's not from an LA specific brochure, but it was not uncommon because This was the way that we were selling single-family home ownership opportunities. And here in LA, we were, like I said, it was all new housing for the very first time. And you can see here on this chart, in the 1920s, we saw in a single year in 1923, we built 43,000 new homes across the city of Los Angeles. The city was a much smaller number of population at that time, and we were building 4 times as much housing in that 1 year as we do in an average year now. In the last decade, we've been averaging only 10,000 new homes a year in the city of LA. We were building double that on average for this decade in the 20s. You'll see that a large portion of that, these black bars, were single family homes, but then the clear bars are doubles or duplexes, and then these hashed bars are multiple or multifamily housing. We didn't have the same kind of, you could only do single family home ownership, in so much of the city. There was a lot of areas in central LA, especially where we were still allowing multifamily housing to get built. You'll see that shifts. Once we emerge, as we're emerging from the Great Depression, we see a jump again in new housing construction, but now it's more disproportionately of what we're building, single family housing. And I've indicated here a red bar along this chart because now we have redlining in place, which we'll see what the impact of that was in just a moment. So the Great Depression, I mentioned that, we saw the Great Depression occur with the stock market crash in 1929. We had FDR gets elected in 1932, and one of the first things of the Great Depression, or excuse me, of the New Deal that he implements is the National Housing Act of 1934, which creates the Federal Housing Authority. The upper left-hand corner here, upper left-hand corner here is a Hooverville shantytown. These were fairly common at the time. People were losing their homes left and right. And so these were named after President Herbert Hoover. They were taking it to mock him for doing so little to address the Depression. And so FDR, recognizing that home ownership was an important part of creating opportunities for people to get out of poverty, made housing a big piece of his New Deal, and the National Housing Act was signed in 1934. And we start to see sort of the development of homes like this bottom corner one that's indicated here. This was the single largest, I will call this, this is my description, this created the single largest affordable housing program ever in the history of our country. The single largest affordable housing program. It also, not just in terms of affordable housing, it also enabled the accumulation of wealth, which is something that our affordable housing programs do not do today. If you're renting a house or you're renting an apartment that's a designated affordable housing project and it's pegged to your rent or to your income, if you start to earn more income, you don't qualify for that anymore. You have to pay more or you have to move out. There are different kinds of restrictions on what you could do, but you can't actually purchase a designated low income apartment and accrue wealth and retain that. But at this time that we created this National Housing Act, the federal government for the very first time stepped in and said, we're going to guarantee mortgages, which was something that was unheard of. Right? The only way you could buy a home at the time was through private lending at the banks. The federal government said, we're going to guarantee a 30-year mortgage. I mean, that's ridiculous that we're going to say, you're going to be able to pay a mortgage for the next 30 years of your life. But the federal government said, we're going to guarantee it because they recognized home ownership was a real big key to getting out of the Great Depression. But this also allowed people to purchase homes that they otherwise could never have afforded and to basically stay in them and accumulate wealth, accumulate the investments that would come with that home ownership over time. So one of the key parts, though, of this was to minimize risk. And the way that we minimized risk, the way that the federal government minimized risk, was to create these home ownership loan corporation maps. These were maps created in cities all across the country that today we call redlining. And redlining maps would color code communities into 4 colors. They put them in 4 colors, either red, yellow, blue, or green. Green being the highest color you could have, blue being next, yellow, and then red. In a redlined community, you could not purchase a home with the backing of the federal government. Period, end of story. You could not. You could not get a federally backed mortgage. Now, you could get a private mortgage, but it would be more expensive, and some people did. But you could not get a federally backed mortgage in an area that was redlined. In a yellow area, you might be able to, but it'd be pretty tough. Blue, you were pretty much okay. Green, no problem whatsoever. Also, if you were not white, you couldn't get a federally backed mortgage. And that held true when we finally passed the Fair Housing Act in 1968. Over 98% of federally backed mortgages were held by white people. So there were a couple people who were not white who were able to get federally backed mortgages, but really, truly, this was a program that was available to people on the basis of their race for over a generation. So we have this redlining, we have these redlining maps. And so what do these mean? So I've circled a couple communities here, one in green, one in red. The green community is directly adjacent to Runyon Canyon in Hollywood, and the red community is in Westlake MacArthur Park. We actually can go and look and see how these communities were described in documents that are still available in the public realm today. But these are the documents that we used at the time to determine if you could get a federally backed mortgage in these communities. So that green circled area was described as having a moderately increasing population with business and professional men, executives, capitalists, with annual incomes of $3,600 and upward, with 0% foreign families, no nationalities, 0% Negroes, and no apparent or anticipated shifting or infiltration. You might say, well, what the heck is shifting or infiltration? That's a curious term. Well, the area that was circled in red gives us a little bit of an idea of what that means, where the population was slowly increasing with skilled artisans, laborers, white collar, and works progress administration workers, 20% foreign families, Japanese and Russian nationalities, and some Mexicans, 10% Negro, and shifting or infiltration of Japs and Negroes rapidly. This document basically determined that this community, where it had redlined, was ineligible for receiving federally backed mortgages because of this, because it was 10% Black households, because there was what they described as shifting or infiltration of people of Japanese descent and Black households, and that it was 20% foreign families. So these were things that were used. These were markers that were used by our federal government to determine if you could receive a federally backed mortgage. And this bears out map after map after map. There's additional descriptions that were provided. In the area that was green, they described it as having racial protection in perpetuity. What that means is that the deed restrictions were strong enough, or expected to be strong enough, that there was going to be no quote unquote infiltration of non-white people into that community. By contrast, the area that was redlined, they described the deed restrictions as quote unquote leaving much to be desired, but do protect against racial hazards. Again, this language of racial hazards. Mixing of races was perceived by the homeowners loan corporation, folks who did these maps on behalf of the federal government, was perceived as being bad, as perceived as being a risk that would make the federal government lose money by investing with its 30-year mortgage program in those communities. So we did this. This was our official policy determining where you could purchase a home with a federally backed mortgage for well over 30 years. So at this point, we instituted redlining with the National Housing Act. There was a recognition at the federal government that there was still a difficulty for a number of people accessing housing. So in addition to providing 30-year federally backed mortgages, we created federal public housing, which was meant to address those needs of low-income Americans who still couldn't afford to purchase a home. However, most of this was also segregated as well. And in fact, in 1949, there was an effort by Republicans in the Congress to insert a poison pill into a reauthorization of this effort, where they would have said, you have to desegregate public housing. And they knew that that would turn off a number of Southern Democrats who would have said, no, I can't sign on to that. That poison pill lost, but what it also reinforced at the national level through the Congress by their actions, that segregation was A-okay, and that there was not going to be any consequences for continuing to segregate federal public housing. And that was very much what we did for decades. So this low-income housing, relatively low-income housing, was available almost exclusively to white households. There was some that was made available to non-white households, but almost exclusively available only to white households. So I talked about deed restrictions, and there was a Supreme Court case in 1948, Shelley v. Kraemer, where the Supreme Court said, nope, we can no longer enforce deed restrictions in the courts. They are not enforceable through the legal system. However, I want to just call your attention. And these are some headlines from the day. The only one that here that's local is this headline here, which was in the Los Angeles Sentinel, which is the longest running Black newspaper, I believe, in the country, where they said that California Negroes can now live anywhere. And they called out here some homes in Sugar Hill, which we'll get to in just a little bit about the importance of Sugar Hill. But this headline here also notes on the right, the highest court refuses to declare these restrictions invalid. So the Supreme Court ruled 6-0 that these pacts were unenforceable. The reason they ruled 6-0 is because 3 of them had to recuse themselves because they lived in homes with deed restrictions that were racial deed restrictions. So you already have this really hitting close to home for a number of members of the court, but then they refuse to say these are illegal. They just say they can't be enforced by the courts. But oh, hey, if communities want to still have these, they can. And it just so happens that many of us live in homes where these restrictions still exist. They've never gone away. Some homes, they've been able to scrap them, but there have been some efforts on the state level to try and scrap these in the state of California. There's been a lot of pushback from assessors' offices because the amount of work involved in doing that is enormous. But these still exist all across the country, and certainly here in California. They don't get enforced. They probably get ignored, but people, I think the way they come up with the news lately is people go, whoa, my gosh, I didn't realize I had this in my home deed, but they still exist. And then in California, we passed Article 34 in 1950. This was put on the ballot by the California Association of Realtors with support from our legislature. Article 34 did something very specific. It said that if you're going to build federal, public, or publicly funded housing, you could only do so if you have a vote in support from the voters in that city. So this was clearly intended, and it worked as intended, to put a stop to any more publicly funded housing being built in the state of California. It had that effect. That law is still in the Constitution. You can go find it. And it still is causing issues for publicly funded housing in the state of California 70 years later. There was an effort that was in the legislature this year to finally put it on the ballot for a voter repeal. And that effort to repeal was also sponsored by the California Association of Realtors in recognizing the historic significance and the racist history of this measure. Unfortunately, I think in part because of everything with the COVID pandemic, that did not make it in time to get on our ballot. However, it had unanimous support to go on the ballot in the Senate when it was brought up there. I would not be surprised to see this coming up to the voters in the next couple of years. And the only way to strike this down out of the Constitution, as far as I know, will be through voter measure. So that is, but here's the thing. You may think, well, but we are building some subsidized housing. It's true. This article, however, still adds, there was a recent estimate I saw where they studied this issue, somewhere between $5,000 and $20,000 in cost per unit of affordable housing to build in the state of California. This measure from 70 years ago, which was put on our Constitution, approved by the voters, in order to essentially stop any more construction of federally funded, publicly funded housing. So then we have this era of white flight. I'm kind of sort of moving through the timeline so you kind of see how these things sort of tie together. We're still in the middle of redlining. Deed restrictions have just been declared unenforceable by the courts. And we move into this era of white flight, which was really supported by 3 things. But well, first I want to just know, white flight was really at its heart about local control. This was about communities sort of creating their own little enclaves where they had their own control. But it was enabled by three things in particular. One, we're again seeing a lot of housing construction in areas where there weren't homes already. In order for developers to do these large housing projects, a lot of them went to the federal government. And the Federal Housing Authority said, okay, cool, we'll give you support, but you have to explicitly only allow white people to purchase these homes, and you have to have deed restrictions that say that they can only resell them to other white people. So even though the U.S. Supreme Court had already declared that deed restrictions were unenforceable through the courts, the Federal Housing Administration was still requiring as a term or a condition for receiving their support for developers to build these large housing tracts in new suburbs around the country, that they had to include these deed restrictions on the basis of race in what they were building. And in fact, that was true in Lakewood, here in Southern California, in the LA region, and a number of communities. So that was one of the three things that made white flight really possible. The next was, and we'll talk a little bit about this in a minute, our rapidly expanding freeway network. So we started building freeways en masse around the region, and that enabled people sort of to, by virtue of their cars, to get further and further out and to access these communities that hadn't been as accessible before, and to continue to access jobs in the city centers that were harder to access if they didn't have the freeway networks. The third was being able to contract, and what we call these contract cities. So I've again offered Lakewood here with their slogan, which you will see at any of their signs: times change, values don't. They are the very first contract city here in Southern California. What Lakewood did was something that other cities hadn't been able to do until that point, and one of the biggest barriers to incorporation was cities would have to stand up their own school district, they'd have to stand up their own fire department, their own police department, their own emergency services. Lakewood contracted out. They contracted with the sheriff's department, the county sheriff. They contracted with the county fire department. They contracted with LAUSD. So they did this, but then it was challenged in the courts. And ultimately, the Supreme Court said, go ahead, it's fine. You can do contract cities. And as soon as that was deemed to be possible, we saw an explosion of these small communities throughout Southern California. In LA County, we have a total of 88 cities. Over a third of those were incorporated in just a 10-year span in this period of time, where we see white flight, where people are leaving LA City proper and going to these small suburbs, which have been developers who are restricting the purchase of these homes to white people only, where they're contracting with these services, and where they're emphasizing local control, and they're only able to access these communities through freeways. So if you think today, like, oh, we're just this, this sprawling community of freeways, there's a reason for that. This is very intentional. This is when this particularly really took off. So about those freeways, we built these primarily through a 3-decade span. And if you're driving on a freeway today, you might just think, well, it's just the freeway. Like, it doesn't necessarily register. Like, this used to be a community. There used to be people who lived where that freeway is now located. We tore out these freeways. These communities. We tore out tens of thousands of homes to build freeways all across our regions. I offer here a couple pictures. The left-hand side is the I-10 being built from the 110 west towards Santa Monica. You can see bits of downtown in the background there. And on the right-hand side is the 110 freeway being built along the western side of downtown. So we ripped out tens of thousands of homes in order to build these freeways. And if you think that where freeways kind of curve here and there is just kind of, it's like just coincidental or whatever, you're sadly mistaken. Our freeway network is very intentional in what it tore out and what it did not tear out. There is, for instance, there was a lot of pushback around freeways going through any kinds of parks, and they really kind of tried to avoid them, except in LA. There's a park in Boyle Heights where we put the freeway right through the lake, and you can still go there today. You just sort of like boggles the mind. But Boyle Heights was one of those communities where it was one of the most racially mixed communities in LA, but it was also redlined. There was a quote I saw from an activist who was talking about the history of freeways here in Los Angeles, where they talk about how, we had a network that was proposed that was significantly more than what we built. Believe it or not, Caltrans and our local transportation officials wanted to build a lot more freeways than we ended up building. But we only ended up building about 60% of the freeway network that was contemplated back in the 50s and 60s. However, in Boyle Heights, we built 100% of the freeways that were planned there. There are 5 freeways that go through Boyle Heights, one neighborhood. I note here as well, the federal government had a big role in this. The federal government passed the Federal Highway Act of 1956, which matched every local dollar with 9 federal dollars. So this was just putting gasoline on the fire of wanting to build freeways around the region. We had built little bits here and there in the LA region, but it wasn't until we had that Federal Highway Act money that we just saw this explosion of freeways getting built across the country, across our region especially. And I offer here a photo. This is the Western Avenue crossing of the I-10 freeway. This, if you drive through here, you don't necessarily really know what that's not anything particularly significant. This is located in Sugar Hill. And I said I'd tell you a little bit about Sugar Hill a few minutes ago. Sugar Hill was one of the nation's wealthiest communities of mostly Black residents in the 1940s onward. So it's this area of really big, glamorous mansions that in the late 30s, early 40s, a number of the white homeowners wanted to move further west. They wanted to go to Beverly Hills. They wanted to go wherever, into, Bel Air, wherever. And they found that there were Black entertainers, people in the movie business, in the television business, who had money, who were willing to buy. And so a lot of the folks in this community started just ignoring the deed restrictions that existed on their homes and selling them to these Black folks who built their own community of wealthy Black residents in Sugar Hill. And Sugar Hill became notorious and notable within the country as sort of one of these really special places for Black folks. And so it grew, and it became sort of this hub of activity until there was discussion around sort of where to build the freeways. And Caltrans had two key choices they whittled it down to. One would have sent it through fraternity sorority row around USC, and another would have sent it right through literally the middle of Sugar Hill. And despite all the protestations of residents of Sugar Hill, this is what they did to it. This is what we did to it. This is what we did to this Black community. And the 10 freeway actually didn't just go directly through the heart of Sugar Hill. It also went right through the center, right down the middle of the only Black community in Santa Monica, where it ends out by the beach. So this was, we can think like, oh, well, this is just sort of where the freeways go. This is very much by design. There's not a coincidence here about where we put these massive, massive concrete facilities. So then, if you're listening, you may be going, oh my God, this is like a lot to absorb. We're just keep going. We're just going to keep going here. We're going to keep going. So we have the Rumford Act in 1963. The Rumford Act was a state bill here in the state of California, where originally it was intended to bar discrimination on the basis of race. Remember, it's still perfectly legal to say, I don't want to sell my home to you because you're Black, right? It's still perfectly legal in 1963. And the Rumford Act sought to undo that. Unfortunately for the state legislature, the best that they could do with the votes they had was to restrict it on the basis of or more. So single was no longer legal to discriminate on the basis of race and who you rented to, or if it was a condominium building. So the voters of California then were asked 1 year later with Proposition 14 that was placed on the ballot to undo the Rumford Act, to make it legal again, once again, to discriminate on the basis of race. And we approved Proposition 14, 65-35, 2-1. Here in LA County, we approved it 70-30. So overwhelmingly, we wanted to be able to discriminate on the basis of race. And you'll see in this pamphlet on the left that it describes Proposition 14 as restoring to California property owners the right to choose the person or persons to whom they wish to sell or rent their residential property. So this wasn't coded language, this was explicit language. You see a rally on the lower right. It was a rally of people in opposition to Proposition 14, with some folks standing in front of them with signs saying they want to protect civil liberties, and they're supporting Proposition 14. They out on that measure. Upper right, Governor-elect Ronald Reagan, one of the very first things he announced once he had won his position in 1966 to become the next governor of California, before he was even sworn in, was that he was going to seek a repeal of this bill. Now, at the time that the governor had been elected, that Ronald Reagan had been elected governor, the current governor, the outgoing governor, Pat Brown, had been challenging Proposition 14 in the courts, which was one of the reasons that people cite for his having lost his re-election bid, because he had been challenging Proposition 14 at the courts, and he would be redeemed a year later in 1967. Of course, Ronald Reagan was now governor, but the US Supreme Court ruled in 1967 that Prop 14 was illegal, thus making the Rumford Act legal again. That was 1 year before we saw the Fair Housing Act of 1960. It was the first federal effort that you could no longer discriminate on the basis of race. This is 52 years ago, the very first time the federal government said, no more, you can no longer discriminate on the basis of race in the case of housing. And I offer here just a couple photos of things. You can see Lyndon B. Johnson signing the bill into law. You can see Martin Luther King Jr. on the left at the March on Washington. He was actually assassinated 1 week prior to the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968. The bill had languished in Congress for many, many months, but it was once he was assassinated that Congress then moved swiftly to pass this bill into law. And there was a lot of folks who appealed to the emotion of that moment to move it and finally get it out of being filibustered in the Senate. I note a couple other things. There's a March on Washington in the bottom right. You can see folks were demanding a number of things, including decent housing, and then some folks who were opposing the Fair Housing Act in the lower left, talking about it would impose all kinds of contractual obligations on people. Essentially, you would be no longer able to discriminate on the basis of race. So that's the last time we have the real explicit, like race is the thing. It's all about race. Now it still plays out, and there's still definitely cases of housing discrimination on the basis of race up to and including this day. There are still things being worked out in the courts. But the Fair Housing Act was really the last time with the federal government coming in and saying no more that we had redlining. It really kind of put the kibosh on deed restrictions, although they still would be enforced in certain places. There was still plenty of race violence where a Black family would buy into a largely and exclusively white community and experience all kinds of violence. These things were still going on. But in terms of the official policy of the federal government, it was no longer official policy that it was perfectly okay to discriminate on the basis of race. And so we started to see these things morph into different things. They're no longer saying black and white, but their effect is that. And this is where I get to that earlier point about individual opinion versus institutional opinion. You can see the effect of the institutional opinion, and that's what I really want to sort of drive home for folks as we think about how our history plays out today. So I call out here CEQA, the California Environmental Quality, signed into law by Governor Ronald Reagan. And what CEQA did was originally intended just to apply to large municipal projects. Freeways in particular were a big one, but anything was a big, large-scale thing happening in a city, CEQA was intended to kind of basically force the government to have to really kind of analyze the environmental impacts of that. But only within just a couple of years of the passage of CEQA, through a number of court cases, it ended up applying to everything. Everything was now subject. Any kind of change to the built environment was now going to be subject to CEQA. And CEQA has ended up becoming one of the biggest barriers to new housing construction here in California. And then just a couple years later, President Richard Nixon puts the kibosh on any more federally subsidized public housing. By this point, I mean, this is only 5 years that the federal government has said you can no longer discriminate on the basis of race in housing. And you'll recall just a decade, 2 decades before that, we had reaffirmed in Congress that segregation in our public housing was perfectly A-OK. Well, now it's no longer A-OK. And not coincidentally, public housing is now getting a bad rap, and the federal government walks away from it. So we're no longer constructing federally supported public housing. But then we also start doing this thing called urban renewal. Where there are communities that the local governments would deem as quote unquote blighted and then obliterate them. This is a community that used to exist in Los Angeles. You wouldn't recognize it today, and we'll see in just a moment why, but this is a community that was redlined when those maps were put together in the mid-1930s. This is Bunker Hill. It was one of the most racially mixed, one of the most ethnically mixed, one of the most income mixed communities anywhere in the city of Los Angeles. But it was redlined for those very reasons. And this is what we did to it. So this is in the 1960s. We razed the entire thing. And in fact, actually chopped down part of the hill and built on top of all of this our LA Department of Water and Power, our theater. There's the Circle Theater Group. There's the LA County facilities. There's now Walt Disney Concert Hall. You'll know Grand Park. So like all of these things are on what had been a thriving, bustling community for many, many decades that we completely tore out through urban renewal because we declared it to be blighted and we destroyed it. But urban renewal is not just something we've done here in LA. Many people are familiar with the story of Elysian Park and Dodger Stadium, but this is all over the country where communities determined communities to be, or where municipal governments determined communities to be blighted, quote unquote blighted, largely meaning they're not just white. And so we tore them out completely. The Arch in St. Louis is an old community that was determined to be blighted. The Seattle Needle and its environment, the Exposition Park around the Seattle Needle, was an old community that was determined to be blighted. The World Trade Center in downtown New York, Manhattan, obviously it's a different building today through that unfortunate tragedy. And before any of that was built, it was a community that the city of city of New York came in to determine to be blighted. So all of these are examples of how we have torn out communities that we determined were blighted for this or that reason, but really race segregation just running rampant throughout our housing policy over the decades. But then we have this other thing. I call it that orange line on the timeline, where I call it sort of constriction or downzoning. Constriction is something we started doing, so now it's legal. Now it's no longer legal to discriminate on the basis of race, right? And so now anyone can live anywhere. Well, now we make it more and more difficult for that to be the case too. And how do we do that? Through constriction. So the photo here is of what a type of apartment that you'll find all over LA called a dingbat, where you've got this 2 or 3 story structure on stilts where people can park underneath, and these apartments on top. There was actually only a very short window of time where we had the construction of dingbats here in the city of Los Angeles. And basically from the mid-50s to the mid-60s. In 1958, shortly after this boom of dingbats started, we increased parking minimums to 1.25 spaces a unit here in LA. So in order to build more dingbats, which are, again, sort of one of our most naturally affordable housing here in the city of LA, architects who were designing these projects would work backward. They'd look at the size of the lot, and they determine how many vehicles that they could accommodate on the lot. And then that would determine how many units of housing you could build. And so this was how we were doing the construction of these dingbats for a number of years until 1964, when we increased parking minimums just a little bit, from 1.25 spaces to 1.5 spaces per unit. What did this do? That ended the construction of dingbats. Now you might think, well, that's just not a very huge increase in parking spaces, but if you've got to reach a minimum threshold, each parking space is going to take another 300 square feet for how much space you've got to provide in order to accommodate, that additional bit of a parking on a lot that's, 5,000 or 6,000 square feet. That's a lot. That is a lot of space that's now being eaten up by parking. I would just note here in this timeline, 1964 is also the year that the voters in the state of California approved Proposition 14, barring the Rumford Act. I don't actually know, because I haven't been able to know the term of this, which happened first. But remember that the Rumford Act applied to buildings of units of 5 or more. And the effect of increasing parking minimums was to eliminate the additional construction of these kinds of buildings that had more than 5 units. So we're seeing things where, constriction, this making it more difficult to build these sort of medium-sized buildings. You might think, oh, well, that's just because people don't like those buildings. Well, why don't they like those buildings? They made it fairly clear why they didn't like those buildings when they approved Proposition 14 in early November of 1964. Just a couple of years later, in the midst of constriction, we've been downzoning. I'll talk a little more about what that all looks like. But in 1978, we approved Proposition 13 in California. This baked in the existing homeowner advantage, so people who are already homeowners, which 1978 is only a decade after we made it illegal to discriminate on the basis of race, right? We have had 50 years where if you want to buy a home, you could only do so if you were white, or if you were not white, you would have had to do so through some private financing, which was going to be much more expensive and make it much, much more difficult for you on every level. So essentially, home ownership has been available only to white folks for several generations, and only 10 years after the federal government passes the Fair Housing Act, we passed Proposition 13 in the state of California. And you'll see on the right-hand side, this homeowner wrote on their house that their taxes tripled, and so they're voting yes on 13. Why did people's taxes triple? Because their home values tripled. Because property taxes were based on home values, and property taxes were the largest contributor of revenues to state and local government finances. at the time. That's what they were. And so they would be pegged every year to sort of where property values were going. And it so happens through several years of significant downzoning, making it increasingly difficult to build new housing in California, housing prices started to rapidly escalate. And when they rapidly escalated, homeowners said, hey, wait a minute, we can't afford our property values, our property taxes going up so quickly. So they passed Proposition 13, which decoupled people's understanding of property values from what they were paying as property owners. And it also baked in this advantage for existing homeowners who were almost entirely white homeowners. And then just a couple years after that, in the city of LA proper, we passed Proposition 86, excuse me, not 86, Proposition U. A lower left-hand corner, there's Zev Yaroslavsky, he was a city council member at the time, went on to be a city or county supervisor for many, many years. He put this proposition on the ballot. Proposition U downzoned every single corridor in the city of LA. And it was billed as a way to stop what we see on the top here. Upper left-hand side is the West Side Pavilion. The middle is the Fujita building in Encino, and upper right is the Beverly Center out in West LA. 3 buildings that were perceived as really just sort of like being explosively big and huge and overwhelming, and we can't have this throughout LA. So the voters overwhelmingly approved Proposition U, 70% in favor, which significantly downzoned all of our major corridors, every single corridor in the city of LA, and wiped off the map space for over 1 million apartments in a single vote. Space for 1 million apartments wiped off the map with Proposition U because of 3 buildings, 3 buildings that were used as sort of the thing that everyone was afraid of. Now, at the same time, LA had seen an explosive amount of strip malls, which, because of Proposition U's really stringent downzoning, its really stringent constriction, made strip malls basically just sort of locked them in place, because there wasn't possible now to build anything else on these properties because Proposition U really made it so stringent. So it basically locked strip malls in place. So, and I recognize that for many people, strip malls are actually they're not entirely a bad thing, because we see a lot of really cool, interesting restaurants and shops and things that are affordable for folks in strip malls. And these are properties in some of our most walkable communities and some of our most successful locations, where if we could build 3 or 4 or 5 stories, we could actually put a lot of affordable housing in these communities, but we can't do it because the voters of LA decided 30 some odd years ago that we weren't going to allow that. So we saw significant constriction starting right around the time that the writing was on the wall around how we were using race to determine who could access housing, and through a number of things that were going on. Increasing the parking units, I talked about that and its effect on dingbats. We reduced height limits. We said you could only build so tall. We limited maximum densities. That's what Proposition U did. It significantly reduced the amount of density you can build on any of our major corridors throughout the entire city of LA. We increased yards and setback requirements. You don't necessarily need to know what all those things are, but why do we require big green yards in LA, which is in a semi-arid climate? Because we do. Because we're afraid of density, because we're afraid of having more people living in communities. Why? Well, you draw the lines together. But what the net effect was of this is that in a 30-year span, that part that I indicated on the timeline with that orange bar, we reduced our zone capacity in LA by 60%. We used to have capacity for building homes up to accommodate 10 million residents, which would have been about the density if we ever built enough housing. If we had 10 million people in the city of LA, it'd be about the density of the city of San Francisco today. But instead, we restricted our density all the way down to just under 4 million residents. And we've made some minor increases over time. But truly, we really kind of closed the door. We hear a lot from our president about building a wall. That's what we effectively did. We built a wall. We built a wall through regulation requirements, our communities, which had almost entirely all grown up in an era of race-based housing opportunities. The one thing that changed, and I call this out here because I think it's important, is Measure JJJ in 2016. It was the very first and only time that the voters have approved a measure saying we want more housing. The one and only time, and it was just 4 years ago. So when I've been talking about all this history, you may think, my gosh, it's all this old stuff. But literally, we want more housing was 4 years ago. So think about like the impact that has in terms of our ability to sort of access housing. And Measure JJJ actually was fairly limited to just those areas that are really kind of up close and to major transit investments. So you'll see that little map on the lower left-hand side, which has color coding around sort of the kinds of upzoning that's allowed. And you see some construction of some new multifamily housing on the lower right. Measure JJJ is the most significant investment in available low-income housing that we've ever seen in the city of LA. There are over 3,500 that I know of. There's a couple folks who put together the data on this. But in just the last 3 years since the city implemented its transit-oriented communities implementation of Measure JJJ, we've seen something like over 3,500 designated low-income apartments and condominiums being proposed through this through the guidance that this program allows. So hopefully we'll get more, and it's all privately funded. This isn't federally funded affordable housing. So it's a significant investment in our community. So just recapping, we sort of walk through all this timeline here. And I just think it's important to keep sort of tying back to how race has played such an important and significant role, and how that is still very much baked into the institutional opinions that determine who can live where. So history is present. The zombies of our past are still coming at us. So let's talk a little bit about how our history shapes our present. Here in LA, the city of LA, this was done back in 2016, but all of the existing housing at the time, you could see what they described here as a boom in 2010 to 2015, because some people were saying we're seeing too much housing construction. Actually, we're seeing less housing construction today than we've ever seen in the last century. And the vast majority of our housing was built when it was perfectly legal to discriminate on the basis of race. So think about that just a little bit. Like, most of the housing in LA was built at a time when people could live somewhere based on, like, what determined where they could live was largely on account of their race. So like, this is not just something that happened a long time ago. This is still very much shaping who has had access to these things. And when people say, you know, I'm so-and-so, I've lived in this community, or my family's lived in this community for 50 years or 60 years. So that means they were here when it was perfectly legal to discriminate on the basis of race. So their access to opportunities has been in part shaped by something that's completely beyond or outside of their own ability. It's just because of the color of their skin. So what are some of the impacts of redlining today? So this is that redlining map I showed you earlier. This is our freeway network. And it talked about how the freeway, the 10 freeway, Interstate 10, went right through Sugar Hill. You'll see here, it almost tracks pretty perfectly through our redlined communities, with the 101 coming up here through Westlake and MacArthur Park area, and then sort of bending up and sort of curving and going right through the one redlined area here. The 5 freeway tracking right along this redlined community. Here's Boyle Heights, with 5 freeways going through it, as I mentioned earlier. So our freeway network really did a bang-up job of not just going completely driving right through redline communities, but also in some cases separating, like over here on the west side, separating this red line community from this blue line community. These were not accidental things. I've also provided here with these blue stars indications of where our existing federally constructed housing, because we did see some federally funded public housing being built in the 40s especially, and you'll see that it's almost entirely in formerly redlined communities. This also ties to other things you might not even expect. For instance, a study that came out a year ago found that redlined communities are up to 13 degrees hotter than greenline communities in their same cities. Here in the LA region, it's something around 4 or 5 degrees. I was looking at the study to see what it looks like here locally. But think about one of those days where it's, you know, a heat wave where it's 90 degrees in a green line community, it'd be 95 degrees in a red line community. And that may not seem like a huge difference. We definitely are aware of the differences in temperature on our microclimates, with the valley being much hotter than the coast. But it's also different just based on whether you're in a formerly red line community or not. Also along the lines of this, formerly redlined communities are much less safe for people who are walking or biking or taking transit. They see a disproportionate clusters of traffic violence that concentrate fatalities among marginalized groups. Another study that just came out in the last couple of years. In terms of the conversation around policing, there's a study that just came out a couple of years ago from a sociologist at Tufts, looking at this and found that predominantly Black neighborhoods, i.e. neighborhoods that were redlined, are simultaneously over-policed when it comes to surveillance and social control, and under-policed when it comes to emergency services. So sort of the basic services that police might be able to offer is a good thing in a community, they're not getting, but then the social control and the surveillance, which are the things that make it more difficult to be in a community, they're getting more of. So this author concludes that policing responds to segregated landscapes, but it also constructs and maintains them. So it's sort of reinforcing those historic barriers that we created over many, many decades. Policing is one way that those continue to be reinforced today. And here we have just a couple maps showing where we have overcrowding in LA County. And also with COVID-19, this whole pandemic that's raging right now, where we're seeing higher degrees of prevalence and where we're seeing higher job losses. So our formerly redlined communities are our most overcrowded communities today. They're the ones that are seeing the highest degree prevalence of COVID-19, and they're the ones that are experiencing the highest job losses. So thing after thing, these are not just coincidental things. So, if you look at this map on the top, these areas here that were green and blue are not overcrowded. They're also the ones that are seeing the lowest prevalence of COVID-19, and they're also the ones experiencing the fewest job losses. So this also plays into this question of housing density. So I've circled a couple areas in the map here in green and red, just to show how this plays out in Mid-Wilshire area. So this is Mid-Wilshire. You can see that there are a lot of blue and some greens in there. The area that was blue, marked blue, is Miracle Mile North, which is actually now a historic preservation overlay zone. And the area that's marked in green is now Park La Brea. And Park La Brea was built after World War II. You'll see on this redlining map that it doesn't have any color on it because it's indicated as a producing oil field. It was still producing oil at the time that the maps were made in the mid-1930s. But when World War II came to an end, we had all these returning GIs who needed a place to live, and we built what ended up being what is still today the largest housing complex west of the Mississippi, one of the most densely populated communities anywhere. That in California, that is still very functioning, actually 6 times more densely populated than this Miracle Mile North community directly adjacent to it on the other side of 3rd Street. So quickly, a little bit about CEQA. I mentioned CEQA and was signed into law, and sort of had some impacts on our housing policy today. A study from 2015 found that fewer than 1 in 8 CEQA lawsuits filed by groups were filed by groups with prior records of environmental advocacy. So in other words, at least 7 out of 8 CEQA lawsuits were filed by groups with no prior records of environmental advocacy. So you might wonder, well, who are these groups? If they're using the Environmental Quality Act and they don't have a record of environmental advocacy, what's going on there? I mean, so I'm just calling that out. You could do a whole session on how CEQA has sort of been abused. This is one sort of clear, 4 out of 5 lawsuits target infill housing versus 1 out of 5 targeting greenfield housing. So of lawsuits against new housing projects, CEQA has overwhelmingly been used to oppose housing in existing communities and not housing getting built out on the fringes where it requires people to drive further to get to it, where it's tearing up existing sort of wild lands, etc. And the legislative analyst looked at this as well in 2016, the State Legislative Analyst Office, and found that projects requiring an EIR took 2.5 years to approve. I just sort of offer here, one of the biggest things that infill housing has been opposed under the concerns of CEQA is traffic. That's something that's changing right now as cities are being required by the state to adopt new measures for how they determine traffic. But for decades, projects that were proposed to be built in city centers had an inherent disadvantage because by virtue of putting more people in the city, in an existing city, they were viewed as creating more traffic. Even if perhaps more of those trips would be people who would be able to walk or bike or take transit because they're now in a city where they have that ability as opposed to being forced to live way out in the suburbs. I just offer this as a quick note here, but common interest developments or CIDs are incredibly common in California. Over 1/4 of Californians live in a common interest development. They're more popularly known as gated communities. These came about during riots in Torrance and here in Southern California in the mid-1960s, when Torrance was still trying to bar housing opportunities for people on the basis of race, and it was still legal at the time, but people were really coming out and like rioting against them, and so they said, okay, fine, we'll privatize our streets, and so you can't even access the streets anymore. And so common interest developments were a very rare thing at the time, and they just kind of exploded from there. So we created this model of housing where you have these large communities that are homogenous in terms of the type of housing, in terms of the price points of the housing, that also end up becoming fairly homogenous in terms of the racial and ethnic mix. Now, that doesn't mean they're all white, but it does mean that there's very little racial mixing that you find in our common interest developments, which are where a quarter of Californians live. Also, just a quick note about historic preservation overlay zones. We had that video from that young woman trying to walk through Country Club Park. Here in Los Angeles, we adopted HPOZs by law in 1979. We now have over 35. And they're often, not exclusively, but they're often homes that were in communities that were deed restricted or unavailable to Black and brown households when those homes were built. These HPOZs require layers of review for any kind of modifications. If it's to change a door, change a fence, plant a tree, whatever the case, you have to go through approval processes with a board of folks who represent the HPOZ of community members who get to decide what you can and cannot do with your property. And we've seen a relatively rapid expansion of HPOZs presently along Wilshire Boulevard, where the LA County residents are investing over $6 billion in the construction of the Purple Line. And what HPOZs are going to effectively do is bar new housing construction where we could potentially have homes for thousands and thousands more people along the biggest investment of transit we're seeing anywhere in the country. But instead, because of these HPOZs, it's going to be restricted and almost impossible to do except right along Wilshire Boulevard. We're seeing persistent homeownership disparities. So just a few years ago, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau looked at any issues of race in the providing of conventional home loans and refinancing, and holding all else constant, they found that Black applicants are denied a conventional home loan almost 3 times as often as white applicants, and denied home refinancing almost 2 times as often as white applicants. These are not insignificant numbers, and this is just a couple of 45% of white households own their home. That compares to only 20% of Black households. In 2015, I put on the timeline the subprime mortgage debacle, I'll call it. But subsequent to all of that, which was targeted specifically, these horrible investment vehicles were targeted toward Black and brown households. And just a few years later, we've seen that 30% of Black and borrowers' homes in total, all homes had gone into foreclosure in the years since the 2008 housing market crash, comparing that with only 11% of whites' homes. The Black home ownership rate in 2020 is about the same as it was at the passage of the Fair Housing Act, and the Black and white home ownership gap is larger today than it has been any time in the past 30 years. One other historical note, I didn't go all the way back to the Civil War, but when we ended slavery with the end of the Civil War, Black households owned 0.5% of all wealth in this country. Today, 170 years later, 160 years later, they own 1% of all wealth in this country. So I also offer here this racial dot map, which is based on the 2010 census. And this provides 4 colors. The blue dots, every single dot represents a person that was counted in the census in 2010, which, by the way, if you have not done your census yet for 2020, please do that. But every dot represents a person. The blue dots in the census are for white persons. The green dots are for Black persons. The red dots are for what the census deems as Asian. And the orange dots are for what the census deems as Hispanic. The closer the dots are together, those are multifamily areas. The further apart they are single family. And so you can kind of see patterns emerge relatively quickly because, and I love maps, so excuse me, but where you've got orange dots, they're almost entirely all very, very clustered. So where you've got Latinx communities, Latinx households, they're almost entirely in multifamily housing communities. Where you've got the red dots, you're seeing a similar pattern. This is Koreatown here. This is part This is the USC area. This is UCLA. This is Palms over here. But then you see green dots, and actually we see some spreading out of green dots here. So we actually have some historic single-family Black communities, Black households purchasing single-family homes without the benefit of the federal government's the federal government's backing of mortgages. So we see communities like Ladera Heights and Crenshaw and Inglewood here, but then mostly where we see dots that are separated, we're seeing it's blue dots. So this is Hancock Park and Windsor Square, Miracle Mile. This is Beverly Hills and up into all of the hills. This is Santa Monica here, some more of Santa Monica, Venice in here. So where you see a preponderance of blue dots, they also tend to be split apart, which would indicate these are single-family home communities. So the patterns we saw established through decades and decades, through generations of race-based home opportunities, still bear out here in the 2010 census, and I would hazard a guess we'll see a similar thing bear out in the 2020 census. So constriction plays out as well in kinds of housing we see built. These are two properties in Silver Lake that were almost identical in size, identical in their zoning today. And on the right, you see a building that was built in 1928 with 28 studio and one-bedroom apartments and no parking spaces. It's 3 stories, and a studio apartment in that building today rents for $1,500 a month. On the left, you see a building that was built under the current zoning codes, which requires all of this parking to be provided. And so they've provided 20 parking spaces for 11 two-bedroom condos. And because of all the parking they're providing, they also have to build up taller. So it's a 4-story building, and a 2-bed condominium in this building goes for $1.1 million. So there's a significant disparity in terms of where these fall in the affordability index. The building on the right that was built in 1928 is illegal to build today. And it's worth noting that a lot of times we hear people talk about neighborhood character and sort of things that are sort of quintessentially our neighborhood. In my neighborhood of Los Feliz, the vast majority of our existing housing today would be illegal to build under our current zoning because we constricted so much. And the vast majority of the housing we have in Los Feliz today is what I describe as mid-size. So 2 to 4 unit, maybe all the way up to 10 unit buildings. Of all the housing in LA today, 8% of our homes are in 2 to 4 unit projects. 10%, only 10% are in these massive 50 or more unit buildings. But of all the housing we've built since 2000, 43% of that housing is in 50 unit or larger projects. So we're seeing a significant shift to these large projects, which are in a much more limited land area. And I would offer that one of the key issues here at stake for us when we think about housing and housing policy is that we continue to limit the construction of multifamily housing to where it already exists. So we're effectively treating our multifamily housing policy the way we treated our freeway construction policy for many decades, which is to essentially put it where we already have people living in communities where we have some of our most naturally affordable housing. So we're using these large multifamily housing projects in a way that we kind of used freeways, not necessarily in exactly the same way, but it's having a similar effect for many folks, which is where we're seeing this sort of challenge around how do we build more housing while also not displacing folks who are already living in certain areas. In downtown with this constriction, we're seeing LA literally accounts for only 1% of the city landmass for the city of LA, for our 500 square miles in the city of LA, only 5 square miles in downtown LA, but it's the site of over 1/5 of all our new housing that we built in the last 2 decades. And in just in 2018, downtown accounted for half of all our new housing in LA. Now, I'm not saying to be building so much housing in downtown, but that also is indicative of how little housing we're building anywhere else. And that we have 495 square miles everywhere else where we're building so little new housing. So downtown is really kind of having to absorb a significant amount of bearing sort of the shouldering the burden of new housing construction for our region. But at the same time, as an article that talked about this noted, downtown LA rents in 2018 increased only 1%, while the rest of the city averaged about an 8% rent increase. So at the end of the day, what this is that building less housing and people demand drives high housing costs. We saw this massive constriction period in time for 30 years. And as a result, when housing prices in California were still more than they were in the rest of the country, but generally moved up at the same pace, once we had really severely constricted where you could build housing, we saw housing prices completely decouple here in California and just go up astronomically. And not coincidentally, that's also when we passed Prop 13 so that people's property taxes did not also go up astronomically. And we've seen housing prices just thoroughly decouple here in the state as a result. A quick little touch on homelessness. The main cause of our homelessness, which has been cited by numerous authors, is our housing unaffordability. It's not the exclusive cause, but it's the main cause. And we're seeing homelessness numbers going up. I would just note that there's been a lot of talk in the midst of this pandemic that homelessness is going to really rapidly expand in our region. I would not be surprised, unfortunately, to see that. But I also think it's important to note that prior to this pandemic, we were seeing significant economic growth and we were still seeing homelessness going up at large numbers. So it does beggar the question, if we're doing really great at one point in terms of our economic growth and we're seeing homelessness go up, and now we're doing really terribly and we're seeing homelessness go up, at what point do we see homelessness be addressed and go down? And what are the policies that get us to that point? I also just want to note a few things in here about our homeless population. 3/4 of them were living here in LA County when they lost their home. 2/3 have been in LA County for more than 10 years. These aren't people coming from outside into LA to be homeless. And the vast majority, over 70%, are neither mentally ill or have substance abuse issues. So this isn't a bunch of people who are unable to, to control some kind of substance abuse issue or have some significant share of the population with mental health issues. Now, it is fair to say that the numbers of people who have mental health issues or substance abuse issues is larger in our homeless population than in our housed population. But you could also potentially argue, and I have seen this argued, that is in no small part on account of the unhoused population not having homes, because just having a home is a significant way to address some of these challenges that people face. So the one main key takeaways I want to point out here is going back to this historic racism in our housing policy. While our Black share of population in LA County is 8%, the Black share of our homeless population is 1/3. So that is a very clear indicator that decades and decades of race-based housing policy are still playing out right now in front of us, right now today in 2020. But I also want to talk just briefly about institutional power. This is really important, I think, for us to recognize that the difference between individual opinion and institutional opinion, and institutional agency and power. Dorothy Walker just wrote, she's the founder of the American Planning Association. She said a number of things there, which I encourage you to read all of that. I think it's phenomenal. But she really kind of calls white people in particular to task for how we have developed a system that advantages white people over others. And she talks about here, a couple of quotes here. First, the very people who support progressive change elsewhere use local control of land use here in our communities to prevent structural changes that would advance the cause of racial justice. And that as long as the people who own land and are already housed have total control over growth and change in their communities, we will never achieve true racial justice and social equities. So she's calling out these meetings that I've offered just a couple of photos, these kinds of meetings, which if you've ever been in, if you've been involved in housing policy for even a brief period of time, you probably attended one of these before the pandemic, where you get like a panel of folks who are all just saying, no, I can't, it's, I support housing, but not this housing. And I've been in this community X number of years and I don't support this, or I have an issue with this or whatever. This happens over and over. And this happens times thousands of times because we've created systems that provide the institutional opinion that keeping things the way they are today, restricting or constricting the opportunities for new housing in our communities today is the way we go about approaching housing policy going forward. So to some, single-family housing, or what I call multifamily housing ban, single-family housing, in my mind, has been a wildly successful affordable housing program. It has enabled millions of white households to accrue massive amounts of wealth. With the support of the federal government through decades and decades of policies that were limiting federal support to white households, which enabled them to build enormous amounts of wealth, which they now can also apply tax write-offs And then, of course, here in California, we passed Prop 13. So that shifted over time. One thing I didn't mention on the Prop 13 slide, but property taxes used to be the bulk of the revenues that our state and local governments would receive. It's now sales and income taxes. And to be fair, California has taken a very progressive approach to its income taxes and really kind of putting the onus on higher incomes to really pay a much larger share of their incomes in their state taxes than folks in middle and lower income brackets. But sales taxes are disproportionately harmful to lower income communities, and we rely heavily on sales taxes in California. That is one of the reasons we're seeing enormous pressure at our local governments to reopen our economies in the midst of a pandemic, because they're so reliant on sales taxes, and we're not getting any right now. They're not seeing it coming in because our economies have all shut down in this pandemic. Sales taxes put a disproportionate share on low-income households. So Prop 13 shifted the onus of the overwhelming revenue tax burden in our state from wealthier homeowner households to lower-income renter households. That is the effect of single-family housing writ large here in California. And largely, I noted institutional agency and power. Prop 13 is a very clear example of that, but how we do housing policy today, day in and day out, is an example of that. I won't talk much about this, but this is a project that was approved by LA County supervisors, a Centennial project that will put 19,000 homes in the middle of a Tejon Ranch, 30 miles outside of Bakersfield, 60 miles outside of downtown LA, in the middle of a wildfire zone. This is how we've done housing for many, many years. Just put it out there, just keep going further and further. This isn't a way to solve our housing crisis, and we got to do better. So a little bit about our region. Why our region is so complex. LA County has 10 million residents, which would make us the 8th largest state in the country. And if you combine the 10 smallest states' populations, they'd still have fewer people than live here in LA County. These are just some maps of our governance, our congressional districts in the upper left, LA City Council in the middle top row with its 15 city council districts, each with over 250,000 residents. We have 88 cities in LA County, 87 outside of the city of LA. And then even with the 88 cities, there's still 1 million residents who live in unincorporated LA County. And the only elected official that they have is their county supervisor, which on the lower left-hand corner, you can see we have 5 county. Lower right-hand corner, state senate districts. So we have myriad elected officials. And so for me, the question that comes up is, if you want to change housing policy, which one of them do you talk to? which one of these elected officials is the one who's going to change anything? We talked about Measure JJJ. That's just city of LA. That's just the city that houses 4 million of our county's 10 million residents. What about the other 6 million people? So governance in our region is incredibly difficult. What's our theory of change here at Abundant Housing LA? I offer this photo of some signs out in a Minneapolis front yard where on the left they say everyone's welcome here. We saw a sort of big explosion of these signs right after the 2016 election. People really wanted to demonstrate that we weren't representative of what this man who got elected to the presidency. But then also on the right saying, but don't change anything. Don't bulldoze our neighborhoods. We need to stop anything changing from the single family home communities that we created in the midst of race-based housing opportunities. So for Abundant Housing LA, we see how Abundant Housing is key to 3 things. 1, everyone has a home they can afford. 2, communities are livable, sustainable. And 3, we're addressing the urgent climate crisis. And in terms of everyone having a housing they can afford, the California Legislative Analyst's Office looked at this question, and basically what they said is, we need more housing. That's what these bullets say here. We need more housing. They did say that affordable housing programs like inclusionary zoning have a role to supplement our broader changes. And at the end of the day, they said policies need to be changed to allow more private housing construction. In terms of communities that are livable and sustainable, the Smart Prosperity Institute in Canada looked at this question of the cost to a municipal government, to a city, per household for any number of services. They added them all up and they found that in a suburban environment, the costs are more than double per household what they are in an urban environment. In other words, suburbs cost a lot more to provide the exact same level of service per household as in a city. So allowing more people to live in a city actually is a more cost-effective way. It reduces the cost burden to our local governments to provide any number of services. And finally, in terms of the climate crisis, the key takeaway for me in this is the International Panel on Climate Change 2018 reports for the United Nations IPCC determined that effective urban planning could reduce greenhouse gas emissions from urban transport between 20 and 50%, which is the target required which is what we need to reduce by in order to reach our 1.5 degrees Celsius target, which all the countries agreed to in the Paris Climate Accords. Of course, the US pulled out of that. But according to IPCC, the key to that is essentially allowing more people to live in communities where they can walk and bike and take transit. So what are some policy approaches we have here for abundant housing LA? Make more room for more houses. Seems basic, seems simple. It's not. It never is. And the way we do planning today, it's incredibly difficult to do it, but this is, to us, key to all of this. Make it easier, cheaper, and faster to build homes. Right now, like that analysis by the legislative analyst that showed it, doing an EIR requires 2.5 years for a new housing project. That's time that's lost of ability, that all of that gets baked into the cost of that housing, that then makes it that much more expensive whenever it becomes available. We want, as part of our agenda, raising money for affordable homes. We are fully on board with any number of initiatives where we get more money to create more affordable housing. Key to all of this is protecting tenants. I talked about the impact of continuing to only allow multifamily housing to get built where it already exists and the impact that has on existing tenants. We have to be protecting tenants at all costs. And finally, encouraging innovation. There are a lot of ways we can look at this, crack this housing nut, if you will. And I think, frankly, we only barely scratched the surface in terms of the real opportunities we can create through housing policy, in no small part because so many people were benefited by the policies of generations past. And by so many people, I mean almost exclusively white people, who frankly don't see any real need to change much of what is going on today. But we need to sort of be more willing to listen and hear what other folks have to say and come up with more innovative approaches to our housing policy. So hopefully, after all of this, you'd like to get involved. And here's some ideas for how to do that. You can join us. You can join Abundant Housing LA and everyone in LA. You can donate. You can follow us. And you can become a project volunteer. Project volunteers, we'll talk about in just a little bit. But part of that, which also something you can do regardless of whether you're a project volunteer or not, is you can attend hearings on housing projects, which of course, as we know right now, are all online. And actually, in some ways, that makes it almost easier because you're not sort of having to go to a city hall or wherever. You can participate electronically. So you can attend, attend, air quotes here, your local community neighborhood council meetings, write and call your city council office. And if you have any questions about any of this, I encourage you to reach out to Abundant Housing LA's organizing director, Roderick Hall. There's his email, roderick@abundanthhousingla.org. So we have great ways you can get involved here with Abundant Housing LA. One of the specific things that we're involved with right now is the Regional Housing Needs Assessment, or RHNA, which is this lengthy couple years process where we basically, as a region here in Southern California, determine, okay, we've got to build X number of homes, and we've got to be able to allow for those homes to get built. And where are those going to get built? Like, what cities have to accommodate how much of that housing? So there's a whole process that, through a plan that was developed, that we've strongly pushed for, and we're successful in getting this coastal plan pushed through. Now we're seeing some pushback in relationship to the pandemic, and that delaying some timelines and cities moving forward with their needs assessment allocations. But we're still pushing here at Abundant Housing LA. We're still, especially in the city of LA, but across the region, really pushing cities to be aggressive in how they provide for the opportunities of new housing construction at all income levels. The Regional Housing Needs Assessment is not just market rate housing. It is actually looking at the construction of housing at every income level in each city and determining whether or not they're meeting those needs. And if they're not at certain income levels, they have to be more flexible in allowing more of the housing to get built. I mentioned project volunteering. This is a commitment. This is where you're checking out like what's coming up in the community near where you live, and you're really kind of sort of being engaged, being involved, helping organize neighbors in the community, and spending some time with it. It's mostly at your computer, almost entirely these days, as anything is really truly. Involves writing letters, researching projects, attending city hearings when you can, and or neighborhood council meetings. I've not said a lot about neighborhood councils. I did mention at the start that I was on mine. Neighborhood councils are in the city of LA only. There's 100 of them. And they're a group of volunteer elected officials from your neighborhood who talk about any number of things going on in the community. But they're often one of the very first places that a housing developer will go with the project that they're proposing to build in a community, where they'll talk about it with the neighbors in the neighborhood council. And often what ends up happening in neighborhood council is just having a couple voices of folks who are saying, we really need this, or we want this and we want it to look like this or whatever, but we do want this. It makes a big difference, because so often the conversation in neighborhood councils is just, no, we don't want this. So having people who are engaged and involved in the community and participating in that way makes a big difference. So that's my spiel. I've gone through a lot of material. I recognize if you've retained even a quarter of it, I will be thrilled. But I also just want to thank you for taking time out of your Saturday afternoon to hang out with me and hear it about Housing LA, and would love to take your questions. I've got my contact information here. I'm on Twitter at Luke H. Clip. I don't really hang out on Facebook anymore. I've still got that on there, but if you really want to follow me, and it'd be on Twitter at this point, or you can shoot me an email with any questions you got. I'm happy to take questions. I've done that after past presentations and provided additional information for the questions that people had. But that said, I'm going to go ahead and stop my presentation, and happy to take questions.
Thanks, Luke. Hi, everybody. This is Esteban again. So if you've got questions, please use the Q&A function, and then I'll ask them to Luke. I'll ask them of Luke in the order that I receive them. So the first question is regarding fire hazards. So obviously we're in fire season. We are seeing some pretty awful fires already. What would you say the approach should be, both to horizontal expansion? You talked about this a little bit, but to communities that already exist.
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I mean, the communities we have are the communities we already have, right? Like, I'm not going to sit here and say we need to tear down communities. What I will say is that, what people don't necessarily understand or realize is when a wildfire goes through a community, people apply for financing that is basically tied to rebuild what you already have. So the way we do sort of emergency support for communities that are affected by wildfires is we give them money to rebuild their homes in exactly the way they had them already. We don't give them financing or support to go live in a community that's not as impacted by wildfires. We don't actually do that. And for my druthers, that's it's like one key policy thing where it's like, well, why do we keep encouraging people to keep living in a community where we know this is an issue? So that'd be one of the things I would just sort of call out. And I don't know what the answer is to that, but I think it's important for us to understand when we think about the impact of wildfire hazard zones, that we continue to encourage people to live in those communities even after, and especially after, they've been impacted by fires. The other is we should stop building new communities in wildfire hazard zones. The Centennial Project I called out there, which will have the density of some of the lowest dense communities anywhere in our region, the environmental project, because they'll have, we know that's ridiculous. We know it's ridiculous because everyone who lives there is going to have to drive for everything, and they're going to be in the middle of one of the highest wildfire zones we have in LA County. But yet, where else are we going to build 20,000 homes in LA County? After I showed you the slide where in the city of LA, we constricted from 10 million zone capacity down to 4 million, where we essentially had just a small little additional bit of give from year to year. We've done that everywhere. So where are we going to build all those homes? So frankly, part of the conversation about wildfire zones is it's not just stop building out in the wildfire zones. We have to be able to create that kind of housing in our non-wildfire hazard zones. So that goes back to the point of being able to build more homes in our existing city environments.
Thank you, Luke. Our next question is about the pandemic. What impact will it have on a range of issues, specifically homelessness and transit?
I mean, I don't have a crystal ball on this one. I feel terribly for what we're seeing right now, and I think anyone who's paying any bit of attention recognizes we're in a very, very difficult moment in time. Not helped by the fact that we're getting zero leadership. If anything, we're getting antagonism from the top levels of government and DC on these issues. Just very basic rent support and rent freezes would go miles toward assisting people in their ability to move through this. Impacts to transit is still unclear. There have been any number of studies that have been done that have now shown that transit is not really a vector for transmission of this disease, but people early on started to believe that it was. And when people believe that, it often doesn't matter how much data you provide to show that that's not the case. Once they believe it and it becomes part of the common nomenclature, it's hard to break down those beliefs. What I would truly hope is that we'll have some ability to provide support, whether at the local or state level, to allow tenants to stay in place for some period of time, whether it's rent support, whether it's rent freezes. I don't like this idea that people's rent are frozen, but then they have to repay it back within a year or something from whatever. I am a homeowner. I can tell you as a homeowner, I have access to ability. We've received letters saying, if you can't pay your mortgage right now, that's fine. Just let us know. We understand it's COVID. That's available to landlords. It should be available to tenants. No question in my mind. And unfortunately, because there is such a lack of leadership from the federal level, that is then that is tying the hands of state and local governments, because the feds are the ones who have the ability to essentially provide massive amounts of cash, right? The state government can't do that. The local government can't do that. They can only spend what they get in. The feds are the ones who can issue all kinds of debt and actually do the kind of work that needs to be done to provide the support across the country. Without that, state and local governments really have their hands tied, because they're also seeing their revenues. So I don't know where we're going to be 6 or 12 months from now, but I hope to God we come up with some good outcomes from this November election that lead to some real meaningful action at the federal level that provides support for folks, because those pictures, I think about those pictures from the Great Depression, and we're seeing worse economic indicators right now than we saw in the Great Depression. And I don't know how far off we are from those kinds of moments where people were just in the worst outcomes, the worst situations. Sorry, I don't have better news on that question. It's just a terrible time right now.
Thanks, Luke. Our next, I guess it's more of a comment from Nancy. Can I mention Judicial Council Rule 1, the main thing preventing evictions? Is there something you could?
I'm happy to, is that to unmute Nancy and have her mention it?
Let's see, let's try that. Okay, Nancy, you're on now.
Oh, hi, everybody. Thank you so much for the presentation. I came in late, but I know there's been obviously a lot of discussion about homelessness and the looming crisis. So I just want to mention to people just very quickly, if they're, because people may not be aware, the California Judicial Council passed Rule 1, which prevented courts from issuing summons. So that has been the main thing preventing massive evictions. That is in jeopardy. That may be ending as soon as August the 14th. So I will convey phone numbers and emails to the host that perhaps they can share with people, and everyone should be calling the Judicial Council to urge them to, keep and extend Rule 1. I believe the upcoming bills that are proposed are tenant protections, which will, I'm supportive of and will protect tenants. Once Rule 1 goes away, we're going to see a massive wave of evictions in LA. The average pre-COVID, the average number of monthly evictions pre-COVID was 3,000. Post-COVID, we're expecting 300,000. There's no way that the attorneys can handle that at this point, although we're working towards solutions. So would really urge everyone to do everything they can to protect Rule 1. And there is information on social media, and I will convey information to the host. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nancy. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Nancy. Our next question is actually from Michael, who is a new board member, Buchanan Housing LA. Welcome, Michael. Thanks for joining us. And he says, thanks, Luke. This was great. Appreciate you doing this and the info. My question, what's the first CEQA reform measure you would pursue that would have the biggest impact on its role in impacting our housing needs?
Thanks, Michael, for the question. And I think one of the biggest I would have pursued is already being implemented, which is that cities are having, or that we've moved away from measuring impacts on our infrastructure using a measurement that was focused strictly on cars to a measure that's focused on the movement of people, which actually shifts the burden in such a way that whereas before CEQA really sort of was generous toward projects that are being built out in the out in green fields, it now makes it much more desirable to build housing on gray fields in cities, sort of infill construction. I think the biggest thing I would say around CEQA is it really, it right now places the onus on anything that's different. So anything that's new triggers CEQA in some fashion, and there's varying levels of how much it triggers CEQA, but anything that's new triggers CEQA. And what I would say is that what CEQA should do instead is set targets of, we want to provide X number of homes within a walkable, bikeable, transit-oriented environment by this date, by this date, by this date. And anything that gets us closer to that should not trigger CEQA. And anything that gets us further away from that should have a much higher burden of environmental review. That to me is sort of where we need to go with CEQA, because right now it assumes that what we have currently is A-OK. And as we know, that's not the case. If we're truly concerned about the environment, our current built environment is actually really problematic and is generating tons of carbon dioxide and having all kinds of problems on our environment that CEQA is blind to in the way that it gets applied. And in my mind, CEQA should establish goals, and then anything that gets us closer to that goal has a much lower threshold of review. It doesn't have the same degree of scrutiny as something that moves us either neutral to that or further away from that goal. So that's my answer to that, Michael.
Thanks, Luke. One question that we've gotten over the past few weeks, especially since we put something out about it, a new piece on our website if people want to visit it, and I think actually it's a good opportunity for you to shed some light on it, is missing middle housing. If you could just describe that for our attendees here.
Yeah, so missing middle is kind of a term that folks in the biz sort of throw around, and we all sort of assume everyone knows what it is, and I don't think that that's fair. But essentially, where we're at this point in our housing environment, especially in Southern California, is we have single-family homes and we have really large, big, multifamily projects, and the missing middle is everything in between that. I showed you the dingbat, right, which we had about a 10-year span where we saw a large amount of construction of dingbats, those 4 to 7 to 8 to 10 unit builds. A lot of homeowners would do because they could build it, and it didn't have a huge threshold to get into, and it would take only 6 months to a year to build these dingbats. So we were seeing a large amount of construction of these. That would be, in my mind, missing middle. 4-unit buildings. So, for instance, something that I'm very interested in is the possibility that folks who own a home, let's say it's in a community that's a lower income community, and they want to be able to have multi-generational family living in their home, or they want to be able to rent out a part of their home, but that's not allowed under our current zoning, because if it's a single family home, it's literally only allowed to have a nuclear family with one owner, with not renting any part out of that property. We should allow people to subdivide their homes into 2, 3, 4-unit properties so that they can rent out to mom or to grandma or to the kids or to a neighbor or whatever, so that they can also generate some income to help them afford that place and be investors themselves in their communities. That's kind of what I mean by missing middle. We've gotten to this place where we have the nuclear single family home that requires you to own all the land and the property on that land in order to live there. And we have the large apartment complexes and condominium complexes, and there's very, very little that's in between that. We've just sort of lost any kind of way of sort of thinking creatively about what that might be.
Thanks, Luke. And that was actually we're all through our questions for today.
Okay.
So,
Well, I just want to thank everyone for participating today. It's always a pleasure doing this. I always learn something a little new from the questions we get. I want to thank Nancy for your comment about Judicial Council Rule 1. I really appreciate you bringing that up to folks here on the call. And I hope that we can share some of that, Esteban, on our social media afterward. And again, if anyone has any questions that you wanted to offer to me directly, here is my contact info one more time. So please, by all means, feel free to shoot me an email. Follow me on Twitter if you're so inclined. I have a lot of opinions that I'm happy to share. And those opinions I note in my profile are mine and mine alone and not a reflection of my day job or anything else. But just want to thank you again, because you have your Saturday afternoon, just about anything, even in the midst of the pandemic, and you chose to spend it with us, and I really appreciate that. I hope that you'll spread the word about all this stuff. You'll get involved however you can. You'll be a supporter of One Housing LA, and you'll encourage others to participate in future Housing 101s.
thanks, Luke. Thank you, everybody. And likewise, if you would like more information on becoming a member, if you aren't already, you can email any of us on the team as well. My email address is Esteban, ESTEBAN, @abundanthousingla.org. So I'll echo Luke in saying thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming, and we'll see you soon for another event.